My father didn't raise his voice. He placed his reading glasses on the counter, looked directly at me, and said, "Marcus needs the shop. You'll sign your half over to him. It's the right thing to do." The words settled between us like stones. I gripped the edge of the workbench. "You can't be serious." He smiled, not warmly. "I am. You've got other options. Marcus has a family to feed." Claire didn't turn around. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed as if it recognized something I was only beginning to understand. My mother's tools hung on the wall behind him. My place in this workshop disappeared with them. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I just stood there, sawdust on my hands, already calculating the distance I'd need to travel to find myself again. The first time I understood what inheritance meant in my family, I was 12. Marcus crashed the delivery van into a telephone pole, the front end crumpling like discarded paper. And before the tow truck even arrived, my father's hand fell on my shoulder. "Sarah, you'll cover his route tomorrow. Learn the stops." Marcus stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, grinning like the accident was a private joke. I memorized addresses until midnight. No one asked if I was ready. That became the architecture of our lives, my effort, his absolution. It didn't register as unfair at first. Children don't question the roles they're assigned. They simply inhabit them. But time sharpened the pattern. Marcus grew into the son who disappeared for months, collected second chances, returned only when money ran dry or praise was plentiful. I became the one who arrived early, worked late, steady. The daughter who kept the family business breathing so no one else had to notice it was struggling. When my mother fell ill, the pattern calcified. I learned to mix her medications without error, to arrange appointments around deliveries, to answer her calls at 3 in the morning when pain made sleep impossible. Marcus sent flowers once, a bright arrangement that wilted in the hospital window. When she died, he flew in for the funeral, held our father's hand during the service, and left before we'd finished sorting her belongings. I stayed, not from obligation, though that word shadowed my days, but because silence had already woven itself into my routines. My father moved through the house like a man searching for something he'd misplaced, fragile in ways he refused to name, and I filled the empty spaces. I managed payroll, negotiated with suppliers, fixed broken equipment, trained new drivers. I told myself it was temporary, that grief required structure. Months became 5 years. In that time, the shop contracted around us. The old cash register stuck on certain numbers, the key grinding before it opened. The loading dock door never sealed properly after the hinge warped. The delivery schedule board hung crooked since the mount loosened. I maintained the invisible machinery without being asked, the kind of work no one notices until it stops. My father noticed only when Marcus called. Those were the nights when the phone rang and his entire demeanor shifted, his laugh returning, his shoulders easing. He would retreat to his office and I would hear the warm cadence of his voice through the thin walls. Afterward, he emerged lighter, energized, making plans, as if preparing for a partnership that had never actually existed. He never mentioned these conversations to me. Once I found the original business incorporation papers in the trash, the ones listing my mother and me as equal partners. He didn't remember discarding them. Still, I convinced myself I was misreading things. Families fracture under loss. They rebuild themselves in crooked ways. My role was to hold the structure steady. What I remember most from those years isn't the exhaustion. It's the quiet moments. The two of us closing the shop at dusk, counting the register with only the security lights on, the ones we kept low because bright fluorescence made his eyes water. He used to rest his hand on the counter as if steadying himself against time. Those evenings felt almost like partnership. But patterns don't dissolve on their own. They simply deepen, carving channels you don't realize you're standing in. When I arrived at the shop early one morning and found him meeting with an accountant, sorting through incorporation papers as if preparing them for transfer, I didn't interrupt. He didn't acknowledge me. The office smelled of coffee and cold morning air. He studied the paperwork with the concentration of a man rewriting history, not me. That was the moment I understood my partnership had always been theoretical. It crystallized on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of ordinary day when the shop usually hummed with its familiar rhythm. I'd just returned from a difficult delivery, my jacket still damp from the rain, cold seeping through my sleeves. My father was standing at the counter with Claire, his new wife, their coffee steaming between them. For a moment, I thought they'd been waiting to discuss the quarterly numbers. Then he spoke. "Marcus called," he said, almost casually. "He's moving back. He wants to take over operations." His voice was calm, rehearsed. I set my keys down. The metal clinked against the wooden counter. "All right," I said slowly, waiting for the context, the plan, something that included me. But he didn't look at me when he continued. "He'll need your partnership share." The words landed efficiently, without weight, like a minor administrative detail he'd forgotten to mention. I felt the familiar pressure of silence settle in my chest. "I'm still here," I said. Not angry, just factual. My father finally turned toward me. His expression remained neutral. "You're 38, Sarah. Time you built something of your own. Marcus has 3 kids. They need stability. This shop can't support both of you." There was no cruelty in his tone, just the smooth certainty of someone stating a fact he assumed I already accepted. But something inside me shifted, as if the ground had quietly tilted. "You're joking, right?" I heard myself say. The words emerged softer than I intended, barely audible over the hum of the refrigeration units. He laughed. Not harshly, not loudly, just dismissively. "No, I'm serious." Claire touched his arm, a small gesture of solidarity. She glanced at me with something that might have been pity, then looked away. No one waited for my response. No one asked what I thought. In that instant, the years collapsed. The late-night calls about a temporary help, the gradual disappearance of my name from documents, the casual mentions of Marcus's plans, the quarterly statements that somehow never reflected my contributions. None of it accidental, all of it leading here. I stood motionless, my palm flat against the counter's worn surface, breathing once to steady the weight pressing against my ribs. "I understand," was all I said. And that's when the part of me that had spent decades accommodating finally went still. I didn't argue that afternoon. I didn't threaten or demand. I did what I'd always done in this shop, moved quietly, observed the spaces between words, the hum of machinery, the shuffle of papers. My father closing the office door as if our conversation had left no residue. I stayed at the workbench long after they left for dinner. The stool beside me, the one my mother used to occupy, felt impossibly empty. That emptiness focused me. It reminded me what silence means when it's finally chosen, not absorbed. By morning, I had clarity. I woke before the delivery drivers. The sky hung gray over the industrial park. My movements were deliberate, almost ritual. I brewed coffee, not for comfort but for precision, and opened my laptop at the workbench. Inside my files, I began gathering what mattered, my contracts, the years of financial records I'd maintained, the invoices I'd managed, the vendor relationships I'd built. Document after document, each one a map of invisible infrastructure. At 5:47 a.m., I logged into the business banking portal in the dim workshop light. My hands were steady, but something inside me trembled, something old, something exhausted. The numbers loaded slowly, revealing the familiar pattern, irregular transfers, funds redirected without discussion. Not the amounts themselves, but the assumption behind them, that what I built was theirs to redistribute. I exhaled once, a long, measured breath. Then I opened a new email to Sandra, the business attorney who'd handled my mother's estate. The message was brief, professional, direct. By 6:30, the shop began waking. I heard my father's truck pull into the lot, the distinct rattle of his diesel engine. He always arrived exactly at this time. I didn't greet him. Instead, I stood at the filing cabinet, photographing documents methodically. He watched me for a moment from the doorway, then walked past without asking what I was doing. That indifference clarified more than words could. It confirmed how invisible I'd become and how uncomplicated leaving would be when no one was really seeing me. Before the drivers arrived, I walked through the shop slowly. I wasn't sentimental. I wasn't mourning. I was documenting, observing the space the way I observed balance sheets. The faulty compressor I'd been nursing along, the scheduling system I'd built from scratch, the supplier contracts negotiated in my name. All the invisible systems that kept this business operational, humming along like a machine no one credited. I left them all exactly as they were. At the office, I didn't mention the previous day. Instead, during my lunch break, I sat in my truck in the parking lot and called Sandra. The attorney my mother had trusted, who'd once told me I should protect what I'd built. At the time, I'd dismissed it. Now, her number felt essential. Sandra's voice was professional, measured, precise. I explained the situation. She asked pointed questions. I answered each one, hearing myself become sharper with every response. "You're listed as a legal partner," she said. "Document everything. Keep copies secure. And Sarah, don't surrender anything without proper legal review and fair compensation. Your decision. Your terms." "My terms," I repeated, letting the words anchor somewhere deep. By the time I returned to the shop, the path forward had formed. That evening, I began preparing, not with boxes, but with strategy. I moved carefully, systematically, the way one might dismantle scaffolding. I started with the essentials: copied keys, client lists, my personal tools stored in plain sight. I didn't disturb the space enough to draw attention. Every item I photographed or secured was chosen with intention, leaving no evidence that I'd already begun detaching. Later that night, while my father and Claire watched television in the house they now shared, I stayed late at the shop, laptop open, files backing up to encrypted storage. "Inventory check," I'd said when he asked. It wasn't a lie. I was taking inventory of everything I built that they assumed was theirs to give away. Over the next 4 days, I constructed a private architecture of exit. During lunch breaks, I met with Sandra, reviewed partnership agreements, confirmed my legal standing. Each consultation added another layer of clarity. On Tuesday, I met with a commercial real estate agent and toured small workshop spaces across the county. Each one a blank canvas, free from inherited expectations. On Wednesday, I opened a business account at a different bank. The simplicity felt like oxygen. I scheduled consultations with 3 of our largest clients for the following week. I mentioned nothing. Each evening, the shop continued as if nothing had shifted. My father discussed Marcus's timeline, talked about transition plans, about how fresh blood would help the business grow. Claire nodded along, offering thoughts about family legacy. I listened without engaging, drinking water at the workbench, letting their plans drift past me like distant weather. They didn't notice how I studied them, the way someone studies a landscape they're about to leave. I observed the rhythms of their assumptions, the pauses, the small assertions of control. My father insisting on certain suppliers, Claire rearranging the front office without asking. These small territorial claims had once frustrated me. Now they educated me. They showed me exactly how much of my life had existed in someone else's framework. On Wednesday night, the shop was unusually quiet. My father had left early for dinner. Claire had gone home hours before. I stood in the center of the workshop floor for a long minute, one hand on a tool chest. This had been my place for decades. It had absorbed my labor, my innovation, my quiet belief that contribution created belonging. But belonging had never been part of the equation, only utility. I went to the office, gathered the last files, sealed them carefully, then placed them in my truck. No drama, no announcements, just completion. At dawn the next morning, the sky still dim, my father left to pick up Marcus from the airport. I watched his truck pull away from the shop lot, the brake lights flashing once before disappearing around the corner. When the street felt quiet again, I exhaled. The shop was finally mine to leave correctly. And the first step of that departure was simple. I unlocked the office, powered up the computer, and sent the email I drafted to every client, vendor, and partner. Professional, courteous, clear. Sarah Morrison was establishing an independent operation. Interested parties could reach me at my new business address. Sandra had reviewed every word. The legal notice to my father followed, formal, documented, irrefutable. By the time Marcus arrived at the shop that afternoon, the foundation had already shifted. The locks hadn't changed, but everything else had. I arrived at noon to collect my personal equipment. The parking lot was full: Marcus's car, my father's truck, Claire's sedan. They were inside, Marcus already sitting at the desk that had been mine, my father animated in a way I hadn't seen in years. I loaded my tools methodically. The large rolling chest, the specialized equipment my mother had given me, the calibration devices I'd purchased myself. No rushing, no hiding, just steady, purposeful movement. When I finished, I stood for a moment in the doorway, looking at the shop the way one observes a photograph, recognizable shapes, no attachment. I drove to my new workshop space. The walls were bare, the floor clean, the windows letting in cold winter light. I positioned the equipment carefully. Sandra arrived with the final partnership dissolution papers and a witness. For the first time in decades, my work existed in a space designed for me. That piece lasted exactly 6 minutes. My phone erupted on the workbench. Dad calling. Dad calling. Dad calling. Then a text, "Where are you? What the hell did you do? Clients are calling about you leaving. Get back here now." Another call. Then Marcus. Then Claire. I didn't answer. The workshop's quiet absorbed the noise like insulation. When I finally drove back to the shop, I parked on the street. The office lights were all on. Through the window, I could see them, Marcus pacing, my father on the phone, Claire at the computer, her face tight with stress. My father's composure had fractured. Panic had replaced his usual certainty. When he saw me walking toward the entrance, relief flickered across his face before anger consumed it. "Sarah, get in here right now. Fix this." I stopped at the threshold. "It's no longer my responsibility." "What does that mean?" Marcus demanded, standing now, arms crossed as if my departure were a personal insult. I held up the folder: partnership agreements, financial contributions, documented communications, client relationships. "This outlines everything I've built, and my legal right to it. You'll find formal dissolution papers inside. I'm no longer working here, and I'm no longer maintaining operations." "You can't just take clients," my father said, his voice rising. "I can," I said simply. And I did. "They're choosing to follow because of relationships I built, not because of a name on a door." My father's face shifted, not with sadness but with the realization that the ground he'd always stood on had moved. He looked at Marcus, then at Claire, then back at me, as if searching for the version of me who used to apologize before he even explained what I'd done wrong. "You've always been reliable," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You've always done what needed to be done." "Not anymore," I said. I placed the folder on the counter and stepped back. Their voices rose behind me, overlapping, demanding explanations, demanding compliance. But the papers were already filed. The decision already made. And the silence that followed me to my truck was the first silence in decades that belonged entirely to me. The first morning in my new workshop felt unreal, as if the air itself had been rewritten. Sunlight spilled across the concrete floor in long, clean lines. No arguments overhead, no disappointed sighs, no voice calling my name from across the shop, just stillness, complete, mine. I brewed coffee without hurrying. The mug warmed my hands, and the quiet settled around me like a structure finally at rest. My mother's tool chest sat near the window, the metal catching morning light. For years, it had been buried under spare parts and forgotten inventory at the old shop. Here, it looked like it had been waiting. I walked toward it, letting my fingers trace the handle. The surface was familiar, holding the shape of a life that once felt solid. In the corner, the space heater clicked as it cycled off. Outside, traffic moved at a distance, soft, muted, respectful. The dissolution papers I'd filed yesterday were now sealed in a drawer. The new business card sat stacked on the workbench. Each item seemed small on its own, but together they formed a quiet truth: the chaos I'd been managing wasn't mine to manage anymore. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't anticipating the next demand, the next dismissal, the next adjustment to someone else's plans. My body recognized the difference before my mind did. My jaw unclenched. My breathing deepened. The tension in my shoulders released, then vanished. I stepped outside, letting the cold morning air move across my face. Cars hummed on the distant highway. A bare tree near the building swayed slightly in the wind. Nothing dramatic had happened. No tearful reconciliation, no explosive confrontation, no sudden understanding, just space. And in that space, a life that finally had room to unfold. Some doors close with a slam. Others close with a signature on legal documents. But the ones that matter most are the doors you learn to close quietly, on expectations, on patterns, on the version of yourself that stayed too long in spaces that never valued what you gave. Walking away wasn't revenge. It was clarity. A boundary drawn not in anger, but in certainty. And in the stillness that followed, I finally heard something I'd been missing for years: my own life beginning, without permission.